The wind, a banshee scream birthed from the belly of a winter sky, tore across the endless white expanse. It clawed at Nathaniel, a small figure lost in the maelstrom, his clothes, already thin and worn, now shredded by unseen barbs of ice and snagging branches. Each gust was a physical blow, stealing what little warmth his 7-year-old body still hoarded. Snow, thick and blinding, turned the world into a swirling vortex of white, erasing landmarks, hope, and the faint, fading trail he thought he'd been following. He stumbled, his small, frost-nipped hands held out as if to ward off the invisible fury of the blizzard that had descended upon the Dakota Territory in the heart of that January of 1887. He'd been with Papa, checking snares. Papa had told him to wait by the big, lightning-struck pine. But the snow had started then, soft at first, like powdered sugar dusting the pines, and Papa hadn't come back. The waiting had stretched, silence broken only by the sighing of the wind, then its moan, and finally, its current, raging howl. Fear, cold and sharp as the ice forming on his lashes, had urged him to move, to find Papa, to find something other than the encroaching, terrifying emptiness. Now, he was just lost. Lost, and so terribly cold. A sound, deeper than the wind's shriek, rumbled through the storm, a low growl, then another, closer. Nathaniel froze, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his ribs. Wolves. He'd heard Papa's stories, seen their tracks in the summer dust. Now they were real, phantoms materializing from the white chaos, their eyes like chips of amber flame in the dim, storm-choked light. They were circling, their forms indistinct blurs against the snow, but their intent was a palpable dread that settled heavier than the cold. He sank to his knees, a sob catching in his throat, too frozen to even form tears. This was it. The tattered fabric of his coat offered no protection against the fangs of the wild, nor the relentless bite of the blizzard. His fate, it seemed, was sealed beneath the raging, indifferent sky. Amos Blackwood cursed as the wind nearly ripped the fur-lined hood from his head. He leaned into it, his own considerable bulk, a bulwark against its force, as he made his way back from the small, hastily constructed lean-to, where his few sheep huddled. The blizzard had come on fast, meaner than any he'd seen in a decade. His cabin, a sturdy structure of hewn logs chinked tight against the elements, was a beacon he kept fixed in his mind's eye, not more than 100 yards distant, yet feeling like miles in this white hell. He'd lived alone for so long, the silence of the mountains, his only consistent companion since Martha, since everything had changed. The wildness outside mirrored the landscape within him, most days. It was a flicker of movement, something small and dark against the snow near the edge of his clearing, that caught his eye. Too small for a deer, too desperate for a coyote. He squinted, his weathered face, framed by a thick, graying beard, creased in concentration. Then he saw them, the wolves, bolder than usual, driven by the storm's ferocity and the scent of vulnerability. And at the center of their tightening circle, the small, dark shape resolved itself into something that made his breath catch, something that hadn't belonged in his solitary world for a very long time. A child. For a moment Amos stood frozen, not by the cold, but by a sudden sharp ache that pierced through years of hardened grief. Then, instinct, primal and protective, took over. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, its cold steel familiar in his gloved hands. He didn't aim to kill, not unless he had to. Ammunition was precious, and the wolves were just being wolves. But a warning shot, something to break their deadly focus, was necessary. He raised the rifle, the wind buffeting him, and fired into the air above their heads. The crack of the shot was swallowed quickly by the storm, but its effect was immediate. The wolves scattered, melting back into the swirling snow as silently as they had appeared, their amber eyes lingering for a moment before vanishing. Amos didn't wait to see if they'd return. He pushed forward, his long legs eating up the distance, his gaze fixed on the small, crumpled form. Reaching the child, he knelt. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, his face pale as the snow, tinged with a frightening blue around the lips. His clothes were pitifully inadequate, ripped and thin. He was curled into a tight ball, not moving. Amos's heart, a thing he'd thought long dead to any tender feeling, clenched with a pain that was almost physical. He gently touched the boy's cheek with a gloved finger. Cold. So terribly cold. but there was a faint flutter of eyelashes, a barely perceptible tremor, alive. "All right, son," Amos murmured, his voice rough from disuse and the bite of the wind. "Let's get you out of this." He slipped the rifle back onto his shoulder and, with a grunt of effort, gathered the boy into his arms. The child was light, far too light, a bundle of fragile bones and frozen cloth. Amos turned his back to the wind, shielding the boy as best he could, and began the arduous trek to the cabin, each step a battle against the storm's fury, the small, precious weight in his arms a stark, unwelcome reminder of a life he had purposefully left behind. The cabin door groaned in protest as Amos kicked it open, then slammed it shut against the howling wind, plunging the single room into a dim, snow-filtered twilight. The sudden silence, broken only by the crackle of embers in the stone fireplace and his own ragged breathing, was immense. He carried the boy straight to the hearth, laying him gently on the worn bearskin rug he'd placed there years ago. Martha had loved that rug. The thought, unbidden, brought a fresh pang. He worked quickly, his movements economical despite their urgency. First, the fire. He added kindling, then larger pieces of split pine, coaxing the embers back to a roaring blaze. Warmth began to seep into the chilled air, a welcome, tangible thing. Then, he turned his attention back to the boy. Those wet, frozen clothes had to come off. His fingers, clumsy in their buckskin gloves, fumbled with the crude buttons and ties. He pulled off the gloves, his bare hands working more deftly, though the cold radiating from the boy's small frame was alarming. The tattered coat, the thin shirt, the patched trousers, they were all stiff with ice. Underneath, the boy's skin was mottled, an unhealthy bluish white. Amos stripped him down to his small undergarments, then quickly wrapped him in a thick wool blanket he pulled from his own bunk. He chafed the boy's hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were more accustomed to the axe handle and the plow. "Come on, boy," he muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious child. "Fight it." He propped the boy up slightly, closer to the fire's radiating heat, but not too close. He knew the dangers of warming someone too quickly after such exposure. He fetched a tin cup, ladled some water from the bucket by the door, and set it near the fire to warm. He had some broth from a boiled rabbit simmering on the hob. That would be better once the boy could swallow. For a long while, there was no sound but the fire and the distant, muffled roar of the blizzard. Amos sat on the floor beside the boy, watching, waiting. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools, a bunk built into the wall, shelves holding meager supplies. It was the home of a man who expected little from life and gave little in return, a fortress against the world and his own memories. The presence of the child was an intrusion, a disruption of the carefully constructed solitude he'd cultivated for so many years. Slowly, a little color began to return to the boy's cheeks. His breathing, shallow at first, deepened. A tremor ran through him, a violent shiver that shook his small frame. Good. Shivering was good. Amos gently rubbed his arms and legs through the blanket, trying to help the warmth penetrate. After what felt like an eternity, the boy's eyelids fluttered again, then opened. His eyes, a startling blue in his pale face, were wide and unfocused at first, then slowly sharpened, fixing on Amos. Fear flickered in their depths. He tried to pull away, a small, weak movement. "Easy now, son," Amos said, his voice softer than he intended. "You're safe, out of the storm." He held out the cup of lukewarm water. "Can you drink a little?" The boy stared at him, then at the cup, his gaze uncertain. He was still shivering, but he nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. Amos carefully supported his head, holding the cup to his lips. The boy drank, a few sips at first, then more, a small sigh escaping him as the water trickled down his parched throat. When he'd had enough, Amos set the cup aside. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, keeping his tone even. The boy's lips moved, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," Amos repeated. "I'm Amos Blackwood. This is my cabin." He gestured vaguely around the small space. "You were mighty close to freezing out there." Nathaniel's eyes darted around the room, taking in the rough walls, the flickering firelight, the unfamiliar large man beside him. The fear was still there, but mixed with it now was a dawning awareness, perhaps a sliver of relief. He licked his dry lips. "The wolves." "They're gone," Amos assured him. "Scared 'em off." He didn't add that they'd likely be back, sniffing around, once the storm abated. No need to frighten the boy further. He was already carrying a world of terror in his small frame. Amos ladled some of the warm rabbit broth into a bowl. It wasn't much, but it was hot and nourishing. He held it out to Nathaniel. "Think you can manage some of this? It'll warm you from the inside." Nathaniel looked at the bowl, then back at Amos. He nodded again, more readily this time. Amos helped him sit up a little more, supporting his back with a rolled-up blanket. He fed the boy slowly, spoonful by spoonful. Nathaniel ate with a quiet desperation that spoke of hunger long unappeased. Amos watched him, a strange mixture of emotions churning within him. Pity, a reluctant tenderness, and an old, familiar ache. The boy was so small, so vulnerable. He reminded Amos of— He pushed the thought away, fiercely. No good dwelling on the past. The past was a frozen landscape, best left undisturbed. When the bowl was empty, Nathaniel's eyelids were drooping. The warmth, the food, the safety were taking their toll on his exhausted body. He leaned heavily against the blanket roll. "You need to sleep," Amos said. He carefully lifted the boy, blanket and all, and carried him to the bunk. It was Amos's own bed, narrow but softer than the hard floor. He laid Nathaniel down, tucking the blanket snugly around him. The boy was asleep almost instantly, his breathing soft and even, his face, in the firelight, looking impossibly young and innocent. Amos stood watching him for a long moment. The storm still raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and snow, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. He didn't know how this boy had come to be lost in such a wilderness, or what would become of him. For now, he was here, a small, unexpected guest in Amos's solitary life. Amos turned back to the fire, poking it needlessly. The silence of the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet breathing of a sleeping child, and with questions Amos wasn't sure he wanted to answer. He settled onto the bearskin rug, his back against a stool, his rifle close at hand. He would keep watch. It was a long time since he'd had someone to watch over. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single small window and the varying intensity of the blizzard. It raged for 3 full days, imprisoning Amos and Nathaniel in their small haven. The wind howled like a hungry beast, rattling the door and shutters, piling snow in great drifts against the walls. Inside, a quiet routine established itself. Amos tended the fire, prepared their meager meals, mostly broth, stewed rabbit, and hardtack softened in water, and watched over Nathaniel. The boy slept a great deal at first, his body recovering from the ordeal. When awake, he was quiet, watchful, his blue eyes following Amos's every move. He spoke little, answering Amos's questions in monosyllables, his voice still hoarse. The fear lingered, a shadow in his eyes, but it was slowly receding, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He ate what was given to him, without complaint, huddling in the blankets Amos had provided, his small form dwarfed by the adult-sized coverings. Amos, for his part, found himself in an unfamiliar role. He was not a man given to easy conversation or displays of affection. His life had been pared down to essentials, to survival. Yet, the boy's presence prized open compartments of his heart he'd thought sealed forever. He found himself explaining things unnecessarily, how to bank the fire at night, the names of the different animal pelts hanging on the wall, the way the storm sounded different when the wind shifted. He did it gruffly, almost reluctantly, as if embarrassed by the unaccustomed flow of words. He learned in fragments a little of Nathaniel's story. The boy and his father, an itinerant trapper named Thomas, had been heading west, hoping to find better prospects. There was no mention of a mother. They'd been caught in an early, unseasonable blizzard further east some weeks back, losing their wagon and most of their supplies. They had been struggling since, trying to reach a settlement before the worst of winter set in. Then, this second storm, and his father, Nathaniel's voice would trail off, his eyes clouding over. He'd say his father told him to wait by a distinctive tree while he scouted ahead. He never came back. Amos didn't press for details. The boy's haunted expression was enough. He suspected the father had succumbed to the elements, or perhaps an accident. Another soul lost to the harshness of the land. One afternoon, as the storm showed its first signs of abating, the wind quieting to a mournful sigh, Nathaniel was sitting by the fire, tracing patterns in the hearth dust with a finger. Amos was mending a tear in one of his snowshoes, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and sinew. "My papa," Nathaniel said, his voice small. "He made good snares, taught me how to set 'em for rabbits." Amos grunted, a non-committal sound, but he paused in his work, listening. He said a man's gotta be able to fend for himself in this country." Nathaniel looked up, his blue eyes fixed on Amos. "Are you a good feller, Mr. Blackwood?" The question, so direct, so innocent, caught Amos off guard. He looked at the boy, at the earnest face turned up to his. He thought of Martha, of the son they'd lost to fever, of the bitterness that had driven him to this isolation. Was he a good feller? He didn't know anymore. He'd become something hard, something solitary. "I try to be, Nathaniel," he said at last, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Try to do what's right." Nathaniel seemed to accept this. He went back to his dust drawing. "Papa said there's bad men out here too, men who'd take what ain't theirs." Amos nodded slowly. "That there are, son. That there are." He resumed his mending, but his thoughts were troubled. The boy was a responsibility he hadn't sought, a complication. Once the weather cleared, he'd have to decide what to do. The nearest settlement, a rough mining town called Redemption, was a good 2 days' ride, and not a place he frequented. He had no love for towns, or the people in them. But the boy couldn't stay here indefinitely. Or could he? The thought was a fleeting, quickly dismissed notion. He wasn't fit to raise a child. As Nathaniel's strength returned, so did a spark of boyish energy. He began to explore the small cabin, his initial timidity giving way to a restless curiosity. He'd examine Amos's few books, a worn Bible, a tattered almanac, a book of Shakespearean plays that had belonged to Martha, his small finger tracing the letters he couldn't yet read. He'd watch Amos carve wood, his eyes wide with fascination as a rough piece of pine slowly took the shape of a bird or a wolf. One evening, Amos found Nathaniel trying to whittle a piece of kindling with a sharpened stone, his brow furrowed in concentration. Amos watched him for a moment, then went to his tool chest and took out a small, well-worn jackknife. He walked over to the boy. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Use this, but be careful, it's sharp." Nathaniel's eyes lit up. He took the knife almost reverently. "For me?" "To borrow," Amos clarified. "Mind your fingers." He showed the boy how to hold it, how to make small, controlled cuts. He wasn't a natural teacher, his instructions blunt and practical, but Nathaniel listened intently, his small hands carefully mimicking Amos's movements. For the first time since his arrival, Amos saw a genuine smile touch the boy's lips, a fleeting but brilliant flash of light in the dim cabin. It did something strange to Amos's chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm finally broke on the fourth morning. The world outside was transformed, a landscape of pristine white, dazzling under a pale, watery sun. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Amos knew the respite might be temporary. Winter on the plains was a fickle beast, but it was an opportunity. "Need to check my traps," Amos announced after their morning meal of oatmeal. "And see to the sheep. You stay here. Keep the fire going. Don't open the door to anyone." Nathaniel nodded, his expression serious. "I will, Mr. Blackwood." The fear that had been a constant companion in his eyes had lessened considerably, replaced by a quiet trust that Amos found both unnerving and, if he was honest with himself, strangely gratifying. Amos bundled up, strapping on his snowshoes. As he reached for the door latch, Nathaniel spoke. Will you be back soon?" There was a tremor in his voice, a hint of the old fear resurfacing. Amos paused. He looked at the boy, small and alone by the fire, and a wave of protectiveness, fierce and unexpected, washed over him. "I'll be back, Nathaniel," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "before dark." He gave a curt nod and stepped out into the bright, cold world. The landscape was breathtaking, but treacherous. The snow lay deep, unmarked save for the tracks of animals. He found his sheep safe, though hungry, in their lean-to. His traps, however, were mostly empty, sprung by the storm or buried too deep. He'd need to hunt soon if they were to have fresh meat. As he worked, his thoughts kept returning to the boy in the cabin. What was he to do with him? He couldn't just turn him out. But raising a child, it was a life he'd thought long past. A life filled with a pain he'd spent years trying to numb. He returned to the cabin as dusk was beginning to paint the sky in hues of purple and rose. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming sight. Inside, Nathaniel was by the fire, carefully tending it, just as he'd been told. He looked up as Amos entered, his face breaking into a relieved smile. "You're back," he said, a simple statement filled with an emotion that Amos couldn't quite name, but that resonated deep within him. "Told you I would be," Amos said, unstrapping his snowshoes. He'd managed to snare a couple of rabbits, and he held them up. Supper. That evening, as they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them. Nathaniel, emboldened by Amos's return, chattered a little about his day, how he'd kept the fire just so, how he'd practiced with the knife, carving a lopsided but recognizable rabbit. Amos listened, offering a grunt or a nod here and there, but his mind was working. He needed to go to Redemption, not just for supplies, but to see if anyone knew of the boy or his father. It was the right thing to do. The thought brought with it a familiar heaviness. Doing the right thing often came at a cost. A few days later, with the weather holding fair, Amos decided it was time. He couldn't put it off any longer. He explained to Nathaniel that he needed to go to the settlement, that it was a long journey, and that the boy would have to stay at the cabin. He laid out enough food and firewood for several days, reiterated his instructions about safety, and promised, again, to return. Nathaniel's face fell. "Can't I come with you, Mr. Blackwood?" he pleaded, his lower lip trembling. "I'm a good walker. I won't slow you down." Amos hesitated. The thought of taking the boy into Redemption, with its rough characters and prying eyes, made him uneasy. But the thought of leaving him alone for several days, after what he'd been through, was equally troubling. The wolves were still out there. He'd heard them howling in the distance each night. And what if something happened to him on the trail? The boy would be alone, truly alone. He looked at Nathaniel's anxious face, the desperation in his eyes. He remembered another small face, another pair of pleading eyes, long ago. The memory was a sharp, sudden pain. "All right, son," he heard himself say, the decision surprising even himself. "You can come, but you stick close, no wandering off. Understand?" Nathaniel's face lit up with an almost blinding joy. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll stick right by you." And so they prepared for the journey. Amos packed sparingly, bedrolls, some dried meat, hardtack, his rifle, and extra ammunition. He fashioned a small pack for Nathaniel to carry, with his blanket and a little food, making the boy feel important and useful. They set out at dawn, the air crisp and cold, the snow crunching underfoot. Amos led the way, setting a steady pace, Nathaniel trudging faithfully behind him, his small legs working hard to keep up, his eyes bright with the adventure of it all. The journey to Redemption was arduous. The terrain was rugged, hidden beneath the deep snow, and they had to break trail much of the way. Amos, despite his gruff exterior, found himself constantly looking back, checking on Nathaniel, making sure he wasn't falling behind or growing too tired. He pointed out animal tracks, named the distant peaks, shared his knowledge of the land, much as he imagined Nathaniel's own father might have done. The boy absorbed it all like a sponge, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet resilience and an eager curiosity. They camped one night under the vast, star-strewn sky, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the crackle of their small fire and the distant howl of a lone wolf. Nathaniel, wrapped snugly in his blanket, lay close to the flames, his eyes wide as he looked up at the glittering heavens. "Papa used to say the stars were holes in the blanket of night, letting the light of heaven shine through," he whispered. Amos looked at him, then up at the stars. He hadn't thought about them that way in years. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man, Nathaniel." "He was," Nathaniel said softly, a hint of sadness in his voice. He snuggled deeper into his blanket. Soon, his breathing evened out, and he was asleep. Amos stayed awake longer, staring into the fire, the boy's words echoing in his mind. He felt a stirring of something akin to peace, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost alarming. They reached the outskirts of Redemption late the next afternoon. It was a raw, sprawling collection of rough-hewn buildings, saloons, and outfitters, clinging to the side of a frozen creek. Smoke plumed from chimneys, carrying the scent of coal fires and stale beer. Men in heavy coats and fur hats eyed them with casual indifference or open suspicion as they walked down the muddy, rutted main street. Amos kept a firm hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, guiding him through the throng. He headed first to the general store, a large, cluttered building run by a dour man named Peterson. While Amos bartered for flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition, Nathaniel stood quietly by his side, his eyes wide as he took in the sights and sounds of the bustling store. It was here that trouble found them. Two men, rough-looking drifters with mean eyes and liquor on their breath, had been loitering by the stove, ostensibly warming themselves. Amos had noticed them when he came in, their predatory stillness setting off a warning bell in his mind. As he was concluding his business with Peterson, one of the men, a tall, gaunt fellow with a scar puckering his left cheek, sauntered over. This was Caleb Vance. His companion, broader but with a duller, more brutish look, Owen Shaw, followed a step behind. Vance's gaze fell on Nathaniel, lingering for a moment too long. "Well now, what have we here?" he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Quite a little feller you got there, old man. Where'd you pick him up?" Amos straightened, his hand instinctively moving closer to the hunting knife on his belt. "He's with me," he said, his voice flat and cold. "None of your concern." Vance chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Feisty, ain't ya? Just makin' conversation." His eyes, however, remained fixed on Nathaniel, a speculative gleam in them. "Looks a bit like that lost boy posters we're talking about a while back. From down old Miller way. Supposedly ran off from his step, kin after his pa died. There was talk of a reward, if I recall." Amos felt a chill run down his spine, colder than any winter wind. He kept his face impassive. "Don't know anything about that. This boy's kin of mine." It was a lie, but it came out smooth and firm. Owen Shaw snorted. "Don't look much like you, Graybeard." "Enough," Amos said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He met Vance's gaze, holding it steady. "We're leaving." He put his hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, ready to steer him away. Nathaniel, sensing the tension, pressed closer to Amos's leg, his small hand clutching Amos's coat. Vance held up his hands in a parody of surrender. All right. No need to get your dander up, just an observation." But his eyes still held that calculating look. As Amos turned to leave, gathering his supplies, he heard Vance mutter to Shaw, "Might be worth looking into. That reward was a fair sum." Outside, the air felt colder. Amos's jaw was tight. He hadn't counted on this. He'd hoped to make discreet inquiries, perhaps at the marshal's office, if redemption even boasted such a thing. Now, he'd drawn unwanted attention. He glanced down at Nathaniel, who looked up at him with worried eyes. "Are those bad men, Mr. Blackwood?" Nathaniel whispered. "They're trouble, son," Amos said grimly. "We'll get our business done and head back. Stick close." He quickly found the small, dilapidated office that served as the marshal's post. The marshal, a weary-looking man named Callahan, listened to Amos's carefully edited story about finding a lost boy, omitting the encounter in the store. Callahan knew of no missing children matching Nathaniel's description in the immediate area, but admitted news traveled slow. He promised to ask around, but offered little hope. As they left the marshal's office, Amos felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He glanced across the street. Vance and Shaw were standing in the shadows of a saloon doorway, watching them. They weren't even trying to be subtle. "We leave now," Amos said, his voice urgent. He quickened his pace, Nathaniel almost running to keep up. They wouldn't make it back to the cabin before dark, not at this pace, but he wanted to put as much distance as possible between themselves and redemption, and those two men. He had a very bad feeling that this wasn't over. The thought of Nathaniel falling into the hands of men like Vance, men who would see him only as a means to a reward, or worse, made Amos's blood run cold. He was no longer just a reluctant caregiver. He was a protector, and he would protect this boy no matter the cost. They pushed hard, leaving redemption behind as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in fiery colors. Amos didn't speak, his focus entirely on the trail ahead and the unseen threat he felt shadowing their steps. Nathaniel, sensing the urgency, kept pace without complaint, his small face set in a determined expression. Darkness fell swiftly as it does in winter. Amos knew they couldn't travel much further in the fading light. He found a sheltered copse of pines, relatively protected from the wind, and decided to make camp. He built a small, smokeless fire, more for a little warmth and to boil water for coffee than for light. He didn't want to advertise their position. "Eat this," he said to Nathaniel, handing him a piece of dried meat and a hard biscuit. "And then get some sleep. We'll start again before dawn." Nathaniel nodded, nibbling on the food, his eyes constantly darting towards the darkness surrounding their small circle of firelight. "Are they following us, Mr. Blackwood?" "Maybe," Amos admitted, "but we'll be ready for them." He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded, and placed it beside him. He wouldn't sleep much tonight. The night was long and tense. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the pines, sounded like an approaching footstep. Amos sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his knees, straining his ears for any sound out of place. Nathaniel, despite his fear, eventually succumbed to exhaustion, curling up in his blanket and falling into a fitful sleep. Amos watched him, the boy's innocent, sleeping face a stark contrast to the harshness of their situation. A fierce protectiveness, raw and powerful, surged through him. He would not let them take this boy. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Amos heard it, a faint crunch of snow, too deliberate to be an animal. He tensed, his hand tightening on his rifle. He gently shook Nathaniel awake. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "and do exactly as I say." Nathaniel's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, his small body trembling. Two figures emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, moving stealthily through the trees. Vance and Shaw. They had found them. Vance carried a pistol in his hand. Shaw had a heavy club. "Well, well," Vance said, his voice a low sneer as he spotted them. "Figured you wouldn't get far, old man. Hand over the boy. There's a hefty sum for his return to his rightful guardian." "His rightful guardian is dead," Amos said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "And he's not going anywhere with the likes of you." He rose slowly to his feet, positioning himself between the men and Nathaniel. Shaw laughed, a brutish sound. "Don't be a fool, Graybeard. There's two of us. Just give us the kid, and we'll let you walk away." "That's not going to happen," Amos said. His gaze flickered to Nathaniel. "Run, boy, head for the creek, then follow it west. Don't stop." For a split second, Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes fixed on Amos. Then, with a small, choked sob, he turned and scrambled away, disappearing into the trees. Vance cursed. "Get the boy, Shaw. I'll deal with this old fool." Shaw lumbered off in pursuit of Nathaniel. Vance raised his pistol, aiming it at Amos. "Last chance, old man." Amos didn't waste time with words. He lunged to the side, just as Vance's pistol barked, the bullet whining past his ear, smacking into the tree behind him. Amos fired his rifle from the hip, not aiming to kill, but to disable. The shot caught Vance in the leg. He howled in pain and surprise, dropping his pistol as he stumbled, clutching his thigh. Amos didn't pause. He knew Shaw was after Nathaniel. He raced past the fallen Vance, ignoring his curses and threats, and plunged into the woods, following the faint tracks Nathaniel's small boots had made in the snow. He could hear Shaw's heavy breathing and crashing progress ahead. He had to reach Nathaniel first. He burst into a small clearing just as Shaw, his face contorted with effort and malice, was reaching for Nathaniel. The boy had tripped and fallen, and was scrambling backwards, terror in his eyes. "Leave him alone," Amos roared. He charged at Shaw, his rifle now clubbed in his hands. Shaw, surprised by Amos's sudden appearance, turned, raising his own club. But he was too slow, too clumsy. Amos brought the rifle butt down hard on Shaw's shoulder. The man grunted in pain, his club clattering to the ground as his arm went limp. Amos didn't give him a chance to recover. A second blow, quick and hard to the side of the head, sent Shaw sprawling unconscious into the snow. Amos whirled around, his chest heaving, his eyes searching for Nathaniel. The boy was huddled at the base of a large pine, his small body shaking. Amos rushed to him, dropping to his knees. "Nathaniel, are you hurt?" The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face, but he launched himself into Amos's arms, clinging to him with a desperate strength. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood," he sobbed. Amos held him tight, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. "It's all right, son. It's all right now. They won't hurt you." He stroked the boy's hair, murmuring reassurances, until Nathaniel's sobs gradually subsided. He knew they couldn't linger. Vance was injured, but he might still be a threat, or he might have other associates. He helped Nathaniel to his feet. "We need to go. Can you walk?" Nathaniel nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked small and shaken, but his gaze, when it met Amos's, was filled with a profound trust and admiration that made Amos's heart ache. They didn't go back for Vance. Amos retrieved Vance's pistol and their meager supplies. Then, taking Nathaniel's hand, they struck out, not towards the cabin, but in a different direction, towards the wild, unsettled country to the north. He would find a new place, a place where they could be safe, where the shadows of the past, both his and Nathaniel's, couldn't reach them. It wouldn't be easy, but as he looked down at the small hand clasped firmly in his, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. They traveled for many days, leaving the familiar territory behind, venturing deeper into the untamed wilderness. Amos taught Nathaniel how to read the land, how to find shelter, how to be patient and observant. Nathaniel, in turn, with his innocent questions and unwavering trust, began to chip away at the last vestiges of ice around Amos's heart. The silence between them was no longer born of caution or grief, but of a comfortable companionship. One evening they found a small, abandoned line cabin nestled in a hidden valley, by a clear, fast-running stream. It was dilapidated but sound. With work, it could be a home. They spent the next few weeks repairing it, chinking the logs, mending the roof, building a new stone hearth. They worked together, Amos teaching, Nathaniel learning with an eagerness that often brought a rare smile to Amos's lips. As the first signs of spring began to touch the land, melting the snow and bringing a faint green blush to the aspens, they stood outside their new home, watching the sunset paint the sky. Nathaniel leaned against Amos, his head resting on the older man's arm. "Is this our home now, Mr. Blackwood?" Nathaniel asked, his voice soft. Amos looked down at the boy, then out at the peaceful valley. He thought of the life he had lost, the solitude he had embraced, and the unexpected gift this child had brought him. He was no longer just Amos Blackwood, the grieving recluse. He was something more. "Yes, Nathaniel," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress. "This is our home." He put his arm around the boy's small shoulders, drawing him closer. The journey had been one of hardship and fear, but it had led them here, to a place of healing, to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, amidst loss and the threat of darkness, they had found not just survival, but a fragile, precious belonging. A testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected kindness that could blossom in the most desolate of landscapes. The wolves were a distant memory, the tattered clothes replaced, and the boy's fate, once seemingly sealed by the blizzard, was now intertwined with his own, in a bond forged in adversity and warmed by the quiet promise of a new dawn.